The national media are up to their old tricks again about Ole Miss quarterbacks.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Locked On Ole Miss podcast is the most watched Ole Miss podcast out there. We bring you the latest Rebels coverage every single day. I'm Steven Willis, a 10-year veteran member of the national media with Yahoo Sports and a former Ole Miss staff member. Thank you for making this the Ole Miss Morning Show. Today, we're breaking down the quarterback conversation and why Austin Simmons is being underrated heading into the fall. He's ranked behind expected names like Diego Pavia and Garrett Nussmeier. We were all fine with that, but he's also behind Arch Manning, who some are hyping up as the number one quarterback in the entire country. But let's be real. Manning's only real standout game was against Mississippi State, a team that got dog-walked by Toledo, and he was benched against Georgia in a blowout. The hype around Manning and to some extent DJ Lagway, it's getting ridiculous because honestly, Ole Miss has a more talented quarterback than both of them. We're free and available on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day, and a special hello to the insiders and everydayers who make the show what it is. And don't forget to check out Chris Gordy at Locked On SEC or Corey Burton at Locked On Vandy for more stories on the SEC, college football, and yes, even Ole Miss. Today's episode is brought to you by the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay with us for the Armada Team of the Week later in the episode. So we're getting ready and people are starting spring practice right now, and all of the pre-spring quarterback rankings started to drop. And the one trend that you saw was that Arch Manning and DJ Lagway were both ridiculously high, and Austin Simmons is ridiculously low. The only ranking on there that you could really think about, I like the fact that Garrett Nussmeier is genuinely high up, and Zach Calzada is down at the bottom because he's flunked out of two SEC programs already, and I do not know why Kentucky thinks he's not going to do it at a third. But Austin Simmons, I talked with the Florida football scout, and I talk to him each and every week. You'll be able to catch the show with him on Sunday, talking about Austin Simmons and what can happen and how the offense is going to change and all of that stuff. And Brian Smith is quite honest about the situation. He says if Austin Simmons isn't the best quarterback in the SEC, he'd honestly be a little bit surprised. He has that level of talent, and he fully expects the Austin Simmons that he knows, that he's seen, that he's talked to be one of the better quarterbacks in the entire SEC. So when all of these talking pundits and talking heads start giving out their lists and rankings and trying to set narratives going into the fall, it's important that we push back against them, because the reality of this football season is they're not very well-informed opinions. If you want to look at the teams that have a 101 shot or better to win a national championship, there are 23 of those teams. 15 of them are replacing quarterbacks going into this season. But it doesn't matter. If you look at returning production by Bill Connolly, the teams that have the least are some of the higher rated teams out there. And that's because when it comes to these lists and this coverage, these people have families. They have things that they have to do. A lot of times they do the blue bloods and what they think is going to be the answer, because the easiest path usually wins. That's the secret to journalism. Easy paths usually win. It's a bleed. If it bleeds, it leads job. So when you see lists like this, it shouldn't be surprising that it's just so biased and wrong in there. Look at it. This is from Athlon Sports right now, and it mirrors, honestly, what lists that are appeared everywhere else as well. The number one quarterback on the list is Arch Manning. We're going to come back to that. Trust me. I am not a huge fan of that. Garrett Nussmeier, I have no problem with that. And Norris Sellers, I have no problem with that. DJ Lagway is too high as well. Diego Pavia is potentially the best quarterback in the entire conference. Nico Iamaleava has a chance to be pretty good as well. John Mateer, we just don't know. What's the difference between Washington State and Oklahoma, even with the offensive coordinator coming over? 7 seems right. He threw for 3,900 yards a year ago, but who knows? Taylon Green from Arkansas threw for over 3,000 yards, still does not belong in the top half of the league. Marcel Reed Marcel Reed's a really good quarterback, and he's going to be really good, but he has a deficiency throwing the football at the moment. Then you get to the new quarterbacks, and that's the important thing to realize about this. If you have a very small sample size, you got dumped down. Now, Jackson Arnold is probably a little bit too low for a quarterback that has went over Alabama under his belt. Austin Simmons is going to be really good, but he is all projection at the moment, and he probably should be 6 or 7 on this list if we're going to be honest about it. Gunnar Stockton, you think he's going to be potentially good, but we'll have to see. I told you about Jackson Arnold. Ty Simpson, he was a 5-star quarterback, but I don't think he's going to end up being the quarterback at Alabama. I think that's going to be Keelan Russell, but we'll talk about that at another time. Blake Shapen at Mississippi State, Bo Pribula at Missouri, and number 16, Zach Calzada. The only name on this list that is probably where he needs to be is Zach Calzada. That's just the way it works out. The reason Austin Simmons is so low, okay, let's just kind of cut them a little bit of slack for a second before I rip them to shreds, is the fact that last year he was 19 to 32, 282 yards, 2 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. He had one meaningful drive against the Georgia Bulldogs to where he was able to lead the team down for a touchdown, and basically was the player of the game in that one. If you paid attention at all of what happened in that Georgia game, that Austin Simmons drive was the drive of the game. That was potentially the drive of the season. And if the last 3 possessions against the Florida Gators go different, or you don't miss a field goal at the end of the Kentucky game, or you hang on against LSU whenever they led only in overtime on the last touchdown, that Austin Simmons drive is the most important drive of the season because of what he did. And he looked so composed, so good. And that gave every Ole Miss fan the feeling that, yes, it's going to be fine. He's real. It's going to be fine. We're not dealing with another Michael Spurlock type situation to where you just hype up a quarterback and he doesn't perform. And there's a legitimately good chance that that happens with Arch Manning and with DJ Lagway, even though they have more game time under their belt right now than Austin Simmons. Looking at the top rank, Arch Manning says projection time. Manning isn't the SEC's most accomplished quarterback going into 2025. You seriously? But the guess here is that he'll end next season at the top. It's all projection. All projection. Manning has a ton of pressure to deliver in 2025. That's true. But he's primed for a breakout season at the controls of Steve Sarkisian's offense. That's not true, but okay. The sophomore has shined in limited action and also showcased the ability to be a bit more rushing and downfield passing ability to the offense. The revamped offensive line with 4 new starters might be the only thing that slows down Manning in 2025. All new wide receivers probably won't help him either. Now, if you take a deep dive into last season for Arch Manning. Arch Manning got thrust into the game in the UTS game. That was the second game of the season when Quinn Ewers got hurt. And he proceeded to go 9 of 12 for 4 touchdowns, 23 yards, 4 touchdowns. Everybody's like, whoa, this guy's something special. After that, people started game planning. The next week against Louisiana Monroe, he was only 15 of 29, 2 touchdowns, 2 picks for 258 yards. Had negative 4 yards rushing in that game as well. And against Mississippi State, who a little bit later on got absolutely dog walked by the Toledo Rockets. So let's not forget that. He was 26 of 31, 325 yards, 2 touchdowns, 0 picks, 6 rushes, 33 yards. And then in the Georgia game, and this is the important part because all of those teams are absolute garbage, just absolute hot garbage. In the Georgia game, Quinn Ewers struggled. Georgia was Georgia. They were complete buzzsaw that night. So they decided to put Arch Manning in the game. He had played the previous 3 weeks. They wanted to see what he can do. Arch looked completely lost when he went into the game and ended up getting benched to return Quinn Ewers back into the game. That's the thing. The apples to apples comparison between Austin Simmons and Arch Manning is why I have hope. Against Arch Manning, against Georgia, Austin Simmons, Jackson Dart got hurt. Austin Simmons was thrust in the game in a relief mode. proceeded to lead the team down the field to score a touchdown that basically put Ole Miss back in the game. Arch Manning looked lost. He had a 21-yard run in that game, ended up with -1 yards. He was not a very good or prolific passer in that game. He wasn't the number one player in the country. He did not flash in that game. That makes me worry that Arch Manning is what we thought he was in high school recruiting, to where he completely tore up 1A and 2A competition in high school, but when they played a good game, he had a bad game. Then Arch Manning did not go to the Elite 11. Then Arch Manning did not play in all-star games. And that leads to the question, what do you have to hide? Now, I think Arch Manning is going to be a good quarterback. Like a good quarterback. I do not think he's going to be as good as Quinn Ewers. And he's certainly not going to be the top quarterback in the SEC or the country. I think he's going to be good. I think Texas is going to be fine. I think that him having the last name Manning is the only thing that is keeping people from talking about Texas as a legit 8-4 possibility going into the season. Road games at Ohio State, at Georgia, at Florida, and Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl. Those are all losable games. And Florida replacing basically everything on offense. It's going to be an interesting season for what's going on. We'll talk about the quarterbacks that have lined up in the SEC and the other quarterbacks that we need to pay attention to that Austin Simmons has to deal with. And with spring less than 2 weeks away, the talking heads are staying quiet about Austin Simmons. See, since they're overlooking Austin, they're just giving him that blessing in disguise for the Ole Miss young signal caller. And the SEC QB roster that is starved for experience, he has the time that has to take advantage of this calm before the storm. So stay tuned. You know, the Armada Team of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, our Locked On college basketball experts are picking one team that stands apart. From top-seeded stars to unexpected upsets, these guys are showcasing the strength and the sheer power needed to push their team forward. This week's Armada team and clear-cut team of the week are the Houston Cougars. Since joining the Big 12 last season, the Cougars have gone a combined 33-4 in conference games, winning the regular season title by multiple games both years. There's no team in college basketball that is more capably embodying the rugged Armada than Kelvin Sampson's squad. Houston's tenacious defense leads the nation in the fewest points allowed per game for the second straight season. And when it comes to the Nissan Armada, I say go forth and conquer, and that's exactly what the Houston Cougars have done here. It's clear that our team of the week is out here ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of Nissan's outstanding vehicles. So take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. So spring practice is a little bit under 2 weeks away. And what we talked about in the first segment about Austin Simmons basically being criminally underrated at this point and almost disrespectful in the way that nobody refers to him. Talking about, I think Austin Simmons has something that he can take advantage of right here. With what's going on in the SEC and the number of quarterback changes that have been made and the uncertainty that exists in college football and the Southeastern Conference in 2025, Austin Simmons has 15 practices in the spring to assert himself as the leader of this team going into the fall and to develop the timing to the new receivers that have just come onto the scene, including Deshaun Stribling and Trey Wallace. Caden Lee is probably going to be the leader of that team moving forward. Now, the offense, in my opinion, is going to change a little bit. We've talked about this over the last couple of shows and over the last couple of weeks. I think the offense is going to be tweaked. And we talked about the influx of tight ends. And we talked about how Lane Kiffin builds his offense and Joe Judge taking a more active role. It all has signs to the offense becoming more pro style. It all has signs that there's more high-speed processing that Austin Simmons is going to be asked of. with the players that Ole Miss brought in that have in their zones a high catch radius in quick to intermediate routes. You want somebody to be able to operate with high processing ability like Austin Simmons and have receivers that can operate in those tight quarters as well. And Deshaun Stribling, Caden Lee, and those guys absolutely can. Caden Lee last year, 57 catches, 874 yards, 2 touchdowns. Kind of a breakout year, even with Trey Harris. If Trey Harris wouldn't have got hurt last year, he'd have broke every record that Ole Miss has, perhaps at a level that Ole Miss would not be able to break it again. He could have completely Cy Young'd that record. But Caden Lee, 57 catches, 874 yards, 2 touchdowns as a slot receiver. He had famously 0 drops in the course of the season. Deshaun Stribling, which by the way, if you talk to insiders in and around Ole Miss, they say that Deshaun Stribling really looks like the real deal right now, and he has a chance to make a Trey Harris type impact when the season starts. He had almost 1,000 yards receiving with Alan Bowman as a quarterback. With bad quarterbacking play that Oklahoma State only won 3 or 4 games, he still almost had a 1,000-yard year, and that's with them being absolutely hot garbage. And then there's Trey Wallace, Harrison Wallace III, wide receiver out of Penn State, 46 catches, 720 yards, 4 touchdowns. All the while with Drew Aller as a quarterback. If you look at his zones on there, there's like 3 zones that's very hot that he was completing like 90% of his passes. He could not throw the ball downfield. He could not throw the ball to the left. Drew Aller is the definition of a limited quarterback. Trey Wallace, though, if you look at the middle zone of the field, in the middle of the field, 10 to 20 yards downfield, perfect NFL passer rating when he gets started. Drew Aller was confident there. He was comfortable there, and Trey Wallace could operate in those confines. So you mix them with the tight ends going on. Austin Simmons has a chance to really do work once spring practice kicks off. And Austin Simmons has a grasp of the offense. It's not a situation where he's learning what he needs to do or where it needs to go. He understands it. He has it. We talk about his cerebral nature of playing the game. A lot of that has to do with the fact that he has basically every concept in his head and where the ball is supposed to go. He knows this offense backwards and front. And now whenever they tweak it and add the different personnel groupings and stuff like that, he's going to be able to put his stamp on this Ole Miss offense in a way similar. Picture back in 2020 to where Matt Corral had a almost telepathic relationship with Elijah Moore and a lot of quick passes where the ball just came out of Matt Corral's hand in a hurry. I think that you could see something very similar with Austin Simmons and Caden Lee. If you look at baseball games, if you look at basketball games, softball games, whenever they get photographed at those games, it is Austin Simmons and Caden Lee at the game. It is obvious that those two have a relationship really similar to what Jackson Dart had with Trey Harris. So whenever I tell you to expect that Caden Lee could be the statistical leader at wide receiver in the entire Southeastern Conference, believe me, because those two have a connection. Those two have a relationship. The first pass in Austin Simmons' Ole Miss career was a touchdown pass to who? Caden Lee. Know that they're going to be a really big deal. The supporting players on this offense very well could be Deshaun Stribling, very well could be Trey Wallace or Caleb Odom or Caleb Cunningham, or the tight ends like Daquan Wright or Luke Haas. Those players are important, but the spring practice to develop the relationship, this wide receiver unit is deeper than it was in 2024. When you had Jordan Watkins and Caden Lee and Trey Harris and all those. The wide receiver unit can go 7 deep. Now, I don't know if all of those are going to play. I don't know what's going to happen there, but it's deeper. And that's a real thing for Ole Miss going into spring practice. And it's going to be imperative on Austin Simmons to take advantage of every single rep of spring practice, because every little bit of timing that can be developed, all of the real things that can be developed between the quarterback, the wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs are going to benefit Ole Miss starting August 31st, whenever they line up against the Georgia State Panthers. Should be really fun. Anyway, coming up, Brian Smith would agree with me. Austin Simmons isn't just a future great quarterback. He possibly could be the top dog in the entire SEC. We talk about the other quarterbacks around the league. Do not miss our final segment for the full breakdown. All right, so Ole Miss and Austin Simmons. Austin Simmons, according to Athlon, the 10th rated quarterback that's out there. Some quarterbacks that have no business actually being ahead of Austin Simmons are ahead of him on the list, including Arch Manning, including DJ Lagway, honestly, including Taylon Green. John Mateer probably shouldn't be ahead of him as well. It's all projection at that point. Marcel Reed absolutely should not. I like Marcel a lot. I think he can be a really good quarterback, and he had a really nice end of the year for Texas A&M. He does not belong ahead of Austin Simmons. And when you look at the new quarterback that's below there, you can tell that this is kind of a lazy list. And this, like I said, the secret sauce is a lot of times in the media field, you're dealing with lazy people. It just happens. They want the most bang for their buck for the least amount of work, just like everybody else. The only difference is theirs is put down on paper somewhere to where you can read it, and they kind of have to own up to it. So you have to have thick skin, is my point. So when you look at Arch Manning, I talked about Arch Manning falling through and like he had no business being number one on this list. DJ Lagway doesn't deserve to be on this list at number 4 either. He should be a top half level player. The reality of it is Arch Manning, DJ Lagway, and Austin Simmons should all be like 6, 7, and 8, or 5, 6, and 7. That's the ballpark that they should have been in. But no, the hypocrisy of these writers, it's out of control of what's going on. Arch Manning, I told you his game stats and broke it down. He did not have a big game against any good team. DJ Lagway, kind of there too. If you look at what he does, he's less than a 60% completion percentage. He threw 9 interceptions. He threw over 200 yards in a game 4 times this season, including in the Gasparilla Bowl against the Tulane Green Wave. But he threw for 456 against Samford. That's what started all this hoopla to begin with. He threw for 259 against Kentucky. He was 7 of 14, had a pick in that game. Against LSU, he threw for 226. He was 13 of 26, threw for 50% in that game. Against Ole Miss, he was 10 of 17 for 180, threw a pick in that game. 133 against Florida State. The numbers do not necessarily bear out an elite quarterback. Now, I'm expecting a jump, okay? Listen, I'm not saying Arch Manning or DJ Lagway are going to be bad quarterbacks. That's not what I'm saying. People are going to comment in the comments and make fun and act like that's what I'm saying. No, I'm saying they don't deserve to be the number 1 quarterback in all of college football. And DJ Lagway doesn't deserve to be ahead of Diego Pavia or Nico Iamaleava. I do not think that DJ Lagway belongs above those two. I don't think DJ Lagway or Arch Manning deserve to be above Austin Simmons, but I digress. When you look at the list of what's going on, there's a lot of stuff happening. Like Lenore Sellers, okay? He's the number 3 quarterback. When Lenore Sellers is allowed to run and everything's working like he had again at the end of the Clemson game or at a couple of times in the course of the season, Lenore Sellers is the number 1 quarterback on this list. It's not even close. But the problem is whenever Ole Miss played South Carolina or when Illinois played South Carolina and he wasn't allowed to get off with his legs, he was a below average quarterback. So his ceiling is the top of the entire league. His floor is down near the bottom of the league is my point. Lenore Sellers at number 3, I can see why he was there. I can also argue it against it. Garrett Nussmeier, number 2, probably the best passing quarterback returning to the Southeastern Conference. But in the one game that his offensive line was not quite right, he got sacked 9 times and didn't look good. Ended up losing the game. Guess what? That offensive line, 3/5 of them graduated and they have to be replaced. What if they're not good? What if they have to deal with pressure for Garrett Nussmeier? He's a different quarterback under pressure, like all quarterbacks. You see what I'm getting at? Diego Pavia, I think he's the dude. He should probably be number one on this list, in my opinion. I don't know if there's anybody better, and he's probably I would probably prefer to him to be the quarterback of my team than anybody else on the list right now. Diego Pavia is legitimately good, and Hugh Freeze, remember, it's never too early to get your Father's Day present for Diego Pavia when you play him this year. Nico Amaleava, good quarterback. He's going to take a step in the next year, and he has a chance to be probably the second or third quarterback in this league, especially in that offense. John Mateer, like I said, we just don't know. He threw for 3,900 yards at Washington State, but this isn't Washington State. And Ben Arbuckle at offensive coordinator is going to make a difference. We'll see how much. Taylor Green threw for over 3,000 yards at Arkansas a year ago, but everybody hit the transfer portal for Arkansas last year. You genuinely don't know what the Arkansas offense is going to look like. He threw for 3,000 yards, and in a year two in a Bobby Petrino system, I expect him to take a step, but what does the team look like? Marcel Reed, all he has to do is improve his passing. Once his passing gets good, he's going to be fine. Austin Simmons has a chance, in my opinion, to be the best quarterback in the SEC by the time this is all said and done. He's the value pick on this whole board, especially with Lane Kiffin calling plays. Gunnar Stockton, there's a quarterback battle in Georgia. I do not even know if Gunnar Stockton's going to be the guy. Either way, if they have an 11 quarterback at Georgia, that's a good sign with Ole Miss having to go over to Sanford Stadium. Like I said, Jackson Arnold has a win over Alabama on his record. He's at Auburn now. There's a story by Zach Blackerby at Locked On Auburn talking about the buzz around Deuce Knight at quarterback. It may not be a home run that Jackson Arnold is even the guy. We'll see exactly how that looks. Ty Simpson, 5-star quarterback. The only time he started, I think, or played a good bit was a USF game in Tampa. That did not go well. We'll see what happens with Ryan Grubb and Kalen DeBoer and those guys in Alabama. Blake Shapen got injured last year. He's a good little quarterback. He genuinely is. Bo Privia, okay, and Zach Calzada is kind of where Zach Calzada needs to be. That's what the list looks like in the SEC. And everybody can develop their own opinion of where this needs to go. I'll tell you, I think the most overrated person in college football in 2025 is Arch Manning, period. It's not even particularly close. I think hype has kind of taken DJ Lagway as well. And the national media has taken that hype and they're doing exactly what they did to Jackson Dart to Austin Simmons. Lane Kiffin gets too much credit about the offense being good. And next thing you know, you're going to be at the end of the year and it's like, I had no idea Austin Simmons was going to look as good as he did. The signs were there. You just didn't look at them. So we'll see exactly how that goes going into the 2025 season. Again, Austin Simmons, if he hits his potential, has a chance to be a very high up ranked quarterback in the SEC in 2025, if not the top. If he doesn't, his floor is probably about where he is right now. I do not see a world that Austin Simmons struggles for Ole Miss as a redshirt sophomore. So we'll see exactly how that looks for Ole Miss as well. So thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your go-to source for Ole Miss sports. We pride ourselves in offering the most comprehensive perspectives, which is why we're the number one Ole Miss podcast out there and Ole Miss's morning show. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the Locked On SEC podcast. Host Chris Gordy holds no punches, covering the best conference in all of college sports. Find Locked On SEC on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Hotty toddy, everybody. And remember, analytics is just the old English words that means bad football. We'll see you tomorrow.